my name's Stephen Moss. I'm an author and a naturalist, and I'm going to be reading from my book, The 12 Birds of Christmas, Chapter 8, The Nightjar. 8 Maids a Milking. On a fine, warm midsummer evening, as dusk begins to fall, a strange, rather mechanical sound floats across a Dorset heath. At first it seems easy to pinpoint the bird's location. Moments later, however, it appears to have flown further away across the gorse-strewn valley, then nearer again. Yet this unseen singer has not moved at all. It is simply turning its head from side to side to achieve a ventriloquial effect. The creature making this bizarre sound is one of the most secretive and enigmatic of all our birds, the nightjar. It may not be obvious why I have chosen the nightjar as the avian equivalent of the 8 maids a milking. For me, a myth linking the nightjar with the sucking of one of our more esoteric farmyard animals is the clincher. More on this in a moment. The nightjar is undoubtedly a very charismatic and unusual bird. In what for him was an uncharacteristically poetic passage, the Victorian ornithologist William McGillivray wrote, "It is evening. The ruddy streaks of the western sky have faded into a dull purple. The moon already in the heavens sends abroad her pale light. There is silence in the woods. How soothing is the placid quiet, the balmy air, and the faint light of this secluded place. Hark! It is the whir of the fern owl, again, nearer, more distant, faint. It has ceased, but there the creature itself sweeps overhead, glides along, flutters, shoots aside, and is off." No modern writer has ever captured the character of this nocturnal bird better, perhaps because nowadays nature writing tends to focus its attention on species that are easier to find and see, and which reward the time-pressed 21st century observer more easily for their efforts. Our distinguished ancestors seem to have been far more familiar with the nightjar than most of us are today. Officially known as the European nightjar, the species living in Britain is about the size and weight of a blackbird. It has long pointed wings, a large mouth surrounded by bristles which help it detect insects when hunting, and cryptically patterned plumage, so that the bird can rest unseen on the ground during the day without being detected. In the early 19th century, the poet John Clare regularly observed nightjars on Emmonsales Heath near his Northamptonshire home, as shown by this wonderfully free-flowing passage. One cannot pass over a wild heath in a summer evening without being stopped to listen and admire its novel and pleasing noise. It is a beautiful mottled bird, variously shadowed with the colours of black and brown, its eyes keen, its bill hook-shaped, and its mouth very wide with the long bristle-like hairs growing at each corner. Clare generally used one old name for the bird, fern owl, but his predecessor Gilbert White, writing half a century earlier, preferred the name that links the nightjar with our Christmas carol, the goatsucker. White was convinced, rightly, that the churring note of the nightjar is produced vocally, unlike, for example, the drumming of the snipe, which uses its tail feathers. He recalled one occasion when he and some neighbours were in a small straw building, and a nightjar came and perched on the roof. As it called, it gave a sensible vibration to the whole building, he said. He also wrote this striking phrase, using both folk names for the bird. Fern owls, or goatsuckers, glance in the dark over the tops of trees, like a meteor. White went on to speculate that the hunting behaviour of the nightjar was the origin of its peculiar serrated middle claw, though others, including William Yarrell, suggested this might be used to rid the bird's plumage of parasites. Another Victorian nature writer, Edward Stanley, Bishop of Norwich, claimed that the claw was elongated so the bird could carry its eggs to a more secure spot if disturbed. Given that Stanley also believed that eagles carry off small children, and other nonsense, it's hardly surprising that Yarrell's is the correct interpretation. The bird does indeed use this unusually long claw to preen its feathers and remove troublesome parasites. Nightjars emerge at dusk to feed on flies, dragonflies and even glowworms, but primarily on moths and beetles, as Thomas Bewick noted. It is a great destroyer of the cockchafer or door beetle, from which circumstance in some places it is called the doorhawk. One modern nature poet, the ornithologist Mike Toms, has coined the alternative name moth gobbler for this voracious bird. According to Lewis R. Lloyd, writing in the 1920s, nightjars were called gabble ratchets and were thought to be the souls of unbaptised infants doomed to wander forever in the air. Gabble comes from a word meaning corpse. Elsewhere in Cheshire and Shropshire, the local name was lichfowl, which also means corpse, an association presumably made because of the nightjar's nocturnal habits. More than a score of local names, quite a lot given that the bird itself is so elusive, include a dozen based on its call, eavejar, razor grinder and screech hawk among them, and several based on its appearance, nighthawk, nightcrow and night swallow. The name nightjar was finally adopted as the official name in 1843 and is a corruption of night chur, referring to the bird's distinctive call. It may sound like a continuous stream of sound, but it is in fact a series of very rapid individual notes, produced at a rate of between 30 and 40 times a second. But of all the folk names for the nightjar, the most puzzling is surely the one that Gilbert White himself preferred, goatsucker. The name is a direct translation of the classical Latin caprimulgus, the nightjar's generic and family name, from capra, meaning she-goat, and mulgere, to milk. The word goatsucker first appeared in English in 1611 and was also used by Ray and Willoughby, Thomas Pennant, and as recently as 2001 as a reference to a bird in Australia. Its use goes back to the earliest writings on birds by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Writing in the 4th century BC, he confidently asserted that, flying to the udders of she-goats, the nightjar sucks them. The Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, perpetuated the myth. Those called goatsuckers enter the shepherd's stalls and fly to the goats' udders in order to suck their milk, which injures the udder and makes it perish, and the goats they have milked in this way gradually go blind. William MacGillivray expanded on these classical references, explaining that the ancients accused it of injuring the teats of goats in its attempt to milk them, and thus it received the name caprimulgus, which, having been translated into modern tongue, it retains at the present day. He also wryly noted that the extreme absurdity of the name seems to be its best recommendation. He was quite right, yet sadly this misplaced belief led to nightjars being vilified and even persecuted for a crime they had not actually committed. So how did this long-standing belief come into being? It does indeed derive from the bird's nocturnal feeding habits, but the nightjar is not stealing milk, rather seizing flying insects which have concentrated around domestic livestock, including goats. The mystery of the goatsucker myth was cleared up more than a century ago, yet the nightjar continues to mystify and surprise us. Whether or not the anonymous composer of the 12 Days of Christmas was thinking about nightjars when he wrote the line 8 Maids and Milking is perhaps a moot point. But given that he would have been familiar with the goatsucker story, I like to think he was. In Britain, the nightjar is largely a bird of open areas dotted with bushes and trees, notably the lowland heaths of southern England, especially Dorset and Hampshire, and more recently conifer plantations. For much of the 20th century, the British nightjar population was suffering a slow but steady fall in numbers. In common with many other insectivorous species, this was because of a combination of the loss of habitats to farming and development and a general decline in large flying insects, especially the larger moths. Yet recently the species has, perhaps surprisingly, reversed this trend. The number of churring males has more than doubled, from just over 2,000 in 1981 to roughly 4,600 today. Nightjars are long-distance migrants, returning here from their winter quarters in sub-Saharan Africa in late April or early May, and remaining until August or September. The best chance of seeing, or at least hearing them, is on a warm, muggy evening in late May or June, on a southern lowland heath, such as Town Common on the edge of Christchurch in Dorset, or the RSPB Reserve at Arn. 20 years or more ago I visited the former location with Bill Oddie and a film crew to try to capture this mysterious bird on video. We had been told that the best way to see the males was to listen out for when their constant churring stops, and you hear that strange yipping call, which indicates that the male has taken to the wing. At this point you may also hear a snapping sound, the male's wings clapping against one another to attract a female. Unbeknown to me, Bill had decided to test out a novel method of getting good views. So, as the male began to call, he whipped 2 clean white handkerchiefs out of his pocket and started to dance, simultaneously waving the hankies in the air. This is supposed to fool the bird into thinking that a rival male, whose wings have white pitches near the tips, is intruding into its territory. That night, despite Bill's best efforts at mimicking a Morris dancer, the ruse failed to work, but I've been assured that it usually does. To see nightjars, you only have a short window of opportunity, an hour or so before and after dusk, for as soon as it becomes properly dark, they stop calling and head off to hunt. When abroad, especially in the tropics, I've often come across other species of nightjars sitting on the surface of roads after dark, which I always assume was so they could warm up using the stored heat rising from the tarmac before flying off to hunt. This may well be one reason. However, studies now suggest that because roads are more open than the surrounding areas, they also provide a good platform from which the nightjars can look out for emerging insects. Nightjars mainly forage in what Graham Martin, author of Birds by Night, calls open airspace. You might imagine this would make studying them easier than, say, nocturnal forest dwellers such as the tawny owl. Yet, as Martin points out, we're still not sure whether nightjars catch their prey by targeting individual insects or simply open their mouths wide and trawl randomly through the night air like hopeful fishermen. When male nightjars have attracted a mate and settled down to breed, they continue to call intermittently, usually at dusk, just before they head out to feed. Both the male and female take turns to sit tight on their precious clutch, incubating the eggs for about 18 days. During this period, they rely on their camouflage to avoid predators, though they do still sometimes fall victim to snakes, crows and mammals including foxes, badgers, hedgehogs, stoats and weasels. Once the young have hatched, they're fairly active, though they are still covered with down until they fledge, another 18 or 19 days later. By then, the female has often found another suitable spot to lay her second clutch of eggs, while the male looks after his original family, feeding them until they are just over a month old. A nightjar is even harder to spot during the day, when it will hide away to avoid disturbance and predators, often roosting horizontally along a branch, almost melting into the tree itself. Or if on the ground, it regularly turns its body to face the sun to minimise any shadow. J.E. Harting believed that the nightjar is almost impossible to find during daylight hours, though he did recall stumbling across one asleep on the carriage drive within 20 yards of the house. The gravel was quite warm and the bird was loath to be disturbed that I almost succeeded in covering it with my hat before it took wing. Nightjars are sometimes accidentally flush during the day, as Harting also recalled. I have twice seen a keeper shoot one, exclaiming, "There goes a hawk!" In the authoritative masterwork, Birds of the Western Palearctic, it is boldly stated that, because of the bird's nocturnal habits and cryptic plumage, seeing them at all is as much a matter of fortune as effort or knowledge. That certainly applies to my very first sighting of a nightjar, back in July 1984, which, even after more than 30 years, remains my closest encounter with this enigmatic bird. And, unlike all my sightings since, it took place in broad daylight on a bright, sunny afternoon. I was walking across Westleton Heath near Minsmere on the Suffolk coast when I heard the unmistakable churring sound of a male nightjar. It seemed to be very close by and coming from the dense, prickly foliage of a gorse bush, so I tentatively approached. As I did, a bizarre apparition rose up into the air like a vertical take-off jet and, still churring, floated away across the heath on soft, noiseless wings. It was one of those encounters that, no matter how many years pass by, I shall never forget. The last word on the nightjar must surely go to the incomparable John Clare, whose sonnet The Fern Owl's Nest uses the metre and syntax of his verse to capture the bird's peculiar jerky flight. The weary woodman rocking home beneath his tightly banded faggot wanders oft, while crossing over the furze crowded heath, to hear the fern owl's cry that woos aloft. In circling whirls and often by his head whizzes as quick as thought, and ill and rest as through the rustling ling with heavy tread he goes, nor heeds he tramples near its nest, that underneath the furze or squatting thorn lies hidden on the ground, and teasing round that lonely spot, she wakes her jarring noise to the unheeding waste, till mottled morn fills the red east with daylight's coming sounds, and the heath's echoes mock the herding boys.